Gerry Butts is currently vice chairman of the Eurasia Group, a risk analysis consulting firm. He served as principal secretary to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau from November 2015 until his resignation in February 2019. From 2008 to 2012, he was president and CEO of World Wildlife Canada. He is praised with having been the architect of the Liberal Party of Canada's election victory in 2015 and 2019. He received a BA and an MA in English Literature from McGill University, where he first met Trudeau. While there, he won the National Intercollegial Debating Championship 2 years in a row. So we're not going to be debating anything here.
It's been a while.
We are here today to talk about the late John Duffy's book, Fights of Our Lives, Election, Leadership, and the Making of Canada, which was published in 2002, and in which he examines 5 great Canadian federal elections. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Oh, it's great to be here. I'm thrilled to be here.
So I'd like to turn to the acknowledgements to start with, just to get a flavor of who John Duffy was, and then get your take.
Sure.
He died March 2022 at the age of 58.
Incredibly, almost a year ago already.
Yeah. So here we go. And this, of course, is part of the Bibliophiles book club conversation. So, I'm just going to read the first and last paragraphs. This book was conceived in 1999, shortly after my wife Jill became pregnant with our first child. At the time, a dear friend told me that pregnancy in the family can be an, quote, intensely creative period for the husband as well. Taking his wisdom to heart, I thought writing a book about my favorite subject would be a pleasant way to pass the time as our fun-filled pre-kid lives curdled into torpid domesticity. So I started writing Fights of Our Lives, and just skipping to the end. My late mother, Mary Ann, showered me with encouragement, especially in her last weeks, sweetly reminding me, as always, of the ultimate purposes of politics and life itself. Above all, Jill and Martine, my beloved wife and daughter, allowed this book to occupy a very large space in a life already crammed with birth, death, and other challenges. Their unstinting support and self-sacrifice made Fights of Our Lives indeed most of the fulfillment in my life possible. I wrote this book so that one day I can show Martine why it is that Daddy has such strange friends and keeps such odd hours. In this sense, as in so many others, this book belongs to my family. So perhaps you could give this perspective of a strange friend.
That's a good question. It's wonderful to hear you read those words, because it's almost as if John is in the room with us when you hear it, and I obviously have not heard his voice in a long time. You know, John was one of the most relentlessly positive people I knew. He had such unbridled enthusiasm for his wife, whom I've known since university. Jill and I were friends way back in university, and he reserved a special enthusiasm for his family, but he applied it to everything he did, and it made him such great company, as we'd say back home where I grew up. And above all else, you know, if you're good company, you're going to do well in life.
Yeah. Well, it's also, it really is wonderful when you hang out with someone and they make you feel good about
right
everything.
Yeah, and their enthusiasm's infectious. You can't help but walk away from the conversations thinking there must be something to what that guy's or gal is onto.
Right. Okay, well,
so we miss him. Everybody misses him, and I'm sure Jill will listen to this. And I couldn't make it to the ceremony, which I'm told was legendary. My wife was there, so I feel really badly for her and the kids.
Yeah, it's kind of shocking. It's always shocking.
It's shocking.
Yeah, Okay, so I want to go just getting into the content of his book.
Where to start?
Well, I'm going to read the first paragraph of the introduction, and I'm going to challenge it. So here we go. Elections matter. This statement shouldn't be controversial, but it is. Academics, journalists, and political dissenters of various stripes have worked very hard for many years to convince voters in democracies that elections are inconsequential or worse, rigged, so that this or that social group maintains dominance no matter what happens at the polls. I don't buy it. And I'm going to suggest that elections don't matter.
Well, I'm with John. I don't buy it either. Many elections don't matter, but the consequential ones, by definition, matter. And I think he picked pretty much the right ones.
I think that very little has changed in the way that Canada's been governed over the last 100 years. Maybe I'm going to sound like a conspiracy theorist here, but Canada has an elite, business elite, that I think controls the politicians, so that it doesn't matter if the Conservatives or the Liberals get into power. They're still in control, and I'll just wind up with what I think is probably the most important report that's ever come out, or one of them that's ever come out of the government, and that's the Parliamentary Budget Office report in 2019 that showed that 0.5% of Canadian population owns 20% of the wealth, and 40% owns 1%.
Right. Well, there's a lot to unpack there. I obviously disagree with the idea that there's a kind of deep state that's in the business community, deep business, let's call it, that controls the family compact. It would have been called at one point in our history, which John writes very colorfully about in I guess in 2 of the 5 elections, the King election and the Laurier election. I think from a certain perspective, if you take a super macro view of things, it all looks the same. It's like watching people from an airplane, right? You can't distinguish identifying characteristics at the individual level. But the policy differences between the parties really matter. You know, there are, I'll give you an example that I think is really important. There are about 1 million kids in Canada right now who, had Trudeau not won the 2015 election, would still be living below the poverty line. So at a certain level, you can say the income distribution, the Gini coefficient score of the country hasn't changed enough over that period. But I come from, as you do, I come from the periphery of the country, not the center of it. And individual experience really matters. That's what democracies are about. And I think that those 1 million kids were worth fighting an election for. And I know that sounds kind of corny, but that to me is a material difference in the outcome. We have a carbon price now in this country that we wouldn't have had Trudeau not formed the government. I'm just picking the election that I was most involved in because I know it best, but the elections that John picks in the book, 1988 in particular, was a monumental change in the structure of the Canadian economy that some still disagree with. But you can make the case that the business community put Brian Mulroney in power to orchestrate free trade, but you can't make the case that they would have had the same outcome had John Turner won the election.
I disagree. I think Turner would have turned toward free trade. It's hard to. You're right, of course. Yeah. This is conjecture, but okay. So we disagree then, but we're not going to debate this, right?
I don't think
I don't want to lose. I hate losing. So
yeah.
And you won the national collegiate.
It was a long time ago.
But I'm sure you haven't lost anything.
Long time ago. I lose every argument with my kids, especially my daughter.
All right. Okay. We exchanged a bit on Twitter, and I put forward that you're a sports fan.
Yes, huge sports fan.
And
a long-suffering Montreal Canadiens fan in particular.
Right. What's so wonderful about John's book is that he draws up these game plans,
right.
these playbooks. There's for each election that he's chosen.
What is that? The double whipsaw strategy?
Yes. Well, no. This one's Laurier's Quebec Bridge. But what I'm just going to suggest is that, and again, it's me being very cynical about politics in this country, because it is like a game. I think it's like the NFL. The players are all doing their thing.
Right.
There's all these wonderful little diagrams of where they're going to run and how they're going to win the game. But over or above it, these owners are making a shitload of money, and people are totally absorbed in it. And yet, that's not the real game here.
Well, what do you think is the real game?
I think it's maintaining the principle. If you're rich, it's staying rich and passing it on to your offspring. And
well, here's what I would agree with. Elections in democracies are fundamentally about the allocation of power, right? That's why we have elections, to decide who has power. And the people who have power don't like to give it up. That is absolutely true. I agree with that, for the most part, with some notable exceptions. But I don't think that they are so smart and well planned out that they've got all sides covered.
And you would know better than anyone else in this country, because you were at the very top.
Yeah, I mean,
you would have been influenced.
I wasn't taking orders from anybody.
Right.
when we were writing up the.
And you must have loved that job.
Other than it had its ups and downs. Other than the then leader of the party, there was nobody. There wasn't some cabal of Bay Street business people telling us what to do. Most of them probably didn't want us to win the election. Yeah,
but again, with SNC-Lavalin, that's what people think. They think,
There's always a market, in especially politics, there's always a market for the message that everybody in politics is in it for themselves. And that hasn't been my experience. It really hasn't. I think that most of the people who I've worked with in politics could be doing a lot better for themselves in other fields, right? I've certainly done better economically outside of politics than inside of politics. But I am old-fashioned and maybe foolhardy enough to think that people get into it for the right reasons, and I think they do. And that's not a partisan point, by the way. That's something I've experienced in both parties, that I think it's troubling how divided the parties have become. Mm-hmm. Although John reminds us that there was never really a halcyon, gentlemanly, as they would say in the olden days, way of doing business. But I do think that I've been through a lot in politics. I come out of it without cynicism about the undertaking.
Well, that's nice to hear. I haven't been involved in it, and I'm really cynical. So, but maybe I'm not. I don't know. I'm just basing it on being a consumer of the news.
Oh, for sure.
And, you know that.
But there's an important distinction there, right? You're a consumer of the news,
right?
And
right.
In my experience, the most cynical people about politics are the media.
Yes, the ever shrinking media.
The sadly ever shrinking media.
The bribed media at this point.
Well, I don't agree with that assessment. If you believe that, then you think the media has always been in somebody's pocket because advertisers used to pay for media.
It's the perception is what I'm concerned about. It's the money that goes into the pockets of newspaper executives, and that bothers me. But again, I'm just speaking as a consumer.
No, I don't disagree with you. I just don't think there's much that's different. You know, the government of Canada has always been the largest advertiser in the country, for instance.
Yeah.
And provincial governments, starting with Ontario and Quebec, depending on the year, are the second and third largest advertisers in the country. So if you think that accepting money from the public purse is skewing the coverage of the government of the day, then that's always been the case.
Yeah. Well, and newspapers used to be party.
Absolutely, that's vehicles. The birth of journalism.
Yes.
You know, this goes back to I think one of the first official employees of the United States Department of State was employed by Thomas Jefferson to create a newspaper to attack John Adams.
Right.
There truly is nothing new under the sun.
Okay, so John used the criteria he picked 5 great elections, and he used the criteria of 1, it was a good fight.
Yeah.
Nation-shaking question, and those would be free trade, schooling, languages, conscription, monarchy, welfare state, central government's power. What do you think is the greatest election in Canadian history? Do you have a favorite? Do you agree with his?
I do. I think, obviously, I like to think that had this book been written in 2022 instead of 2002, he would have included the 2015 election in that list as a 6th. But I think he has picked the right ones. And interestingly, I think one of the most consequential elections, because it represented the first real transfer of power outside of a party, was the Laurier's first victory, lost in 1891, obviously. And the conclusion John draws, if I remember it correctly, is counter to his thesis. He sort of says this election was important because it showed that the institutions of this nascent country were strong enough to withstand a real test of one of his criteria, in that case, obviously, the Manitoba schools question.
Yes.
Right, that Laurier, his famous Sunny Ways slogan was really about kicking the can down the road on a very difficult question.
That's right. He just sort of ignored it and put it off.
Completely. I mean, contrary to the popular view of what Laurier did for the Francophone minority in Manitoba at the time, he sold them down the river. He
caved,
Absolutely sold them down the river.
Well, and this is what John says in his, indicates in his diagram here, playbook number 2. He says, Laurier, and this is Laurier's Quebec Bridge. 2 appeals, economics for English, the English population, and play down the Manitoba schools question. And then because I mean that would put him in hot water though with Quebec, no?
Well, Laurier was insightful enough to know that, and John writes about this in the book, that if there were a realistic chance to put the first Francophone in the Prime Minister's chair, that Quebecers were going to vote for him regardless of his position on the Manitoba schools.
Right.
So, you know, a lot of great leaders, there's this tension, and John writes about this beautifully. You know, I should find a passage actually, because he said it much better than I will paraphrase it. I think it was one of the first things.
And there's no rush here. I'll just I'll just edit it out, whatever.
There it is.
Okay.
So this is a bit of a long passage, but I think it'll give the listeners a good flavor for the book, which you should read if you haven't, because it's probably the best
You think so, eh?
accessible book written on Canadian political history. And of course, it expands beyond just political history.
Exactly. What's so fun about it is you can think about it and think about today's elections too.
Absolutely, he puts you in the room, right? So this is another way of answering your question from earlier. That when you view it from afar, you tend to think of politics as structural, right? That there are these almost inhuman forces that create conflict and resolve those conflicts. But what John does in this book is he reminds you that there are people that have to make decisions that we're either going to be about X or Y, and if you choose one path, it ramifies into a certain kind of consequence, and if you choose the other, it's very different. And I think he paints this picture of, I love the picture how vividly he describes what Laurier's train ride must have been like across Western Canada, in really the first election in which that was kind of possible, right? In the pre-writ period, which he describes in vivid detail, his stops in especially Winnipeg, because the schools question is burning at the time, and he has to meet. His job is to meet all of the people who are deeply personally invested in the outcome of the debate and convince them that he's open-minded, that he hasn't drawn a conclusion based on his own cultural background.
Right.
Either way. And
because they closed down the French-speaking schools,
absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Is he okay with that?
Well, he doesn't know. And that's the toughest position to be in politics, where there's a difficult debate and you're not sure where you stand on it. So it's easy to, go on TV and talk about it or do a podcast about it. But if you're sitting in that office over there and the outcome of the resolution of the debate depends on what you personally think, and you don't know what you think.
Yes.
And this is the interesting picture that John paints here. So I'll read a little bit about this. As Laurier matured in federal politics, he struggled to break the bleu monopoly on patriotism, Catholicism, and national reconciliation. Laurier moved into this territory not only out of a desire to win votes, but also from the deep conviction that for Quebec, a close association with English Canada and its institutions was the surest means of joining the elite club of successful liberal societies. This link posed certain challenges, however. Not only did Laurier have to convince French Catholics that liberalism did not mean dissolving into an English Protestant stew, but once he became federal party leader, it became necessary as well to persuade English Protestants that he wasn't some French agent of the Pope. It was a cruel paradox. In English Canada, the Tories flayed Laurier for being too French and too Catholic. In Quebec, they flogged him for being not French and not Catholic enough. The intellectual man of ideas was easily nailed to the political cross of race and religion. Welcome to the big leagues, monsieur. That is a perfect description of what the situation that Laurier faced. And he somehow was able to resolve it.
Well, this is it. Yeah, as you say, he kind of postponed it. It's funny, I can't help but think of our current Prime Minister when he kind of smiles his smile, and you know that he's sort of putting something off. He's not. You know what I mean? He's
well,
kind
I think all politicians, if they're put in a position where they have to articulate a view they're not comfortable with, will try and figure out a way to defer that moment, right? And we do it ourselves in our personal life. It just doesn't mean anything when we do it.
Like in Canada, you have to appeal to groups that are antagonistic.
Yeah.
You have to say two different things. What do you do?
Well, I think this is as true of Justin Trudeau as it was of Wilfrid Laurier. You have to figure out a way to articulate a higher value goal that puts the sectarian conflict in perspective, right? And he writes beautifully about the epistolary relationship that Laurier had with, and I'm going to forget who was the editor of the Globe at the time.
All I can think of is Defoe, but that's that's Winnipeg.
That's Winnipeg. It wasn't.
And that was earlier, I think.
Yeah, and it wasn't Clifford Sifton, who was also Winnipeg, but it starts with a W. It's like Williamson or something like that.
Okay.
Anyway, so he was the person, funnily enough, because journalists tend to have the reputation of being focused on what's right in front of them, and political leaders are supposed to get up into the crow's nest and look at the horizon. Laurier was vexed by this question. He didn't know how he could take a stand. And the editor of the Globe reminded him that what was important, truly important, was not the resolution of the schools issue in Manitoba, because the Manitoba government was not going to allow that situation to be resolved. What they would end up doing is challenging federal authority in the jurisdiction. Right. And the federal government would be revealed to be a paper tiger. And that would cause a much bigger structural problem in Confederation than whatever Laurier would decide on that question. And in other words, he was saying you could in vain attempt to help the Francophone minority in Manitoba and as a consequence lose the country.
Right.
Which I thought was it was wise advice for the ages. And Laurier took it. He knew enough to take it.
Well, and that's the other thing. If you're being sort of hammered for some sort of decision,
yes,
I mean that's Trudeau today. It's like he's being hammered for a decision, and all he can do is sort of smile, and just sort of. People call him all sorts of names because he's. You know what I'm saying? No,
we're talking about this book.
Yes, right? I know. I know. Sorry, and I've got you. I've got you here, and I'm fascinated by this.
It's totally fine. I think that that is
stick to the book.
That's part of the job description, right?
Right.
Right. I think it was Harry Truman who said, "If you want a friend in Washington, get a dog."
Yes.
It's also true in Ottawa and every other provincial capital or city hall in the world.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Okay. So back to the book. John points to an increasing emphasis on the leader. It used to be parties, and what's quite fascinating, I thought, was. It used to be almost more democratic, because if you didn't please the party, they'd boot you. Now they can't do that.
Well, democratic if you were a white male.
No, but that understood.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying that the way that our system is structured now, the MPs have hardly any power at all to turf out the leader, if any.
Yeah, I think.
Whereas before, it was a big consideration, wasn't it?
Oh, for sure. But it was. I think it's more. It's not exactly black and white, Nigel. I think that MPs could not turf popular leaders, right? And if leaders maintained the confidence of the public in the various ways in which that has been measured throughout the ages, the vivid descriptions in John's book, principally about the conservative leadership transition, the successive short-lived, in one case, literally short-lived.
Yes.
Conservative.
Didn't he choke in Victoria's lunch table?
Lunch table.
Yes.
That those were all, who wanted to follow Sir Johnny Macdonald in the Conservative Party. And it was almost inevitable that you were going to have a succession of weak leaders and squabbling amongst the caucus.
Yeah.
But I think that the vesting the power of choosing a leader in the hands of the caucus has very clear negative consequences, some of which our cousins in Great Britain are living through this year.
Yes, I mean, they're revolving.
Right.
Yeah.
Right,
yeah.
Because who do they represent after all?
Yes, there's that, but then there's also the fact that our leader vets all the candidates.
Yeah.
So how can you have a revolt if your leader has to approve everything?
Well, you could ask Sean. You could ask Sean Christian that question. But I think that the point that John makes in the book is that there was a vast infrastructure in the party in the old days that he describes it as sort of the middle classes of the political parties that range from, I won't remember all of the different factions, that range from cabinet ministers to funders to all the way down to volunteers, who were mostly young men who saw the volunteer role as a way to work their way into the system that they could eventually work up through. And he says, and I think correctly, that vast infrastructure has been replaced for better and worse by a direct relationship between the leader and the public.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That the people that Sir Wilfrid Laurier would see when he was Prime Minister of Canada, they were all politicians, right? And he had very few ways to communicate with the public, and that the opposite is the case these days.
Yes. Yeah. Well, if he wants to, he can go on Twitter and get an eyeful of that.
Yeah.
Okay, so policy and leadership are tools used to shape coalitions out of regional clay. I love the use of the word clay there. Yeah. Balance between regional realities and national dreams. I guess that's kind of another theme that played.
Yeah, that's always the case. I think I would invert John's first point. I think that you figure out what it is you think needs to be done, and then you try and build a coalition of support to do it. And of course there's an interrelationship there between how do you, after all, discover what you think needs to be done. You go out and talk to people and try and understand what's happening in the country better than your opponent does, right?
Yes.
Which I think is...
So you present a solution that's what? The thing is, you present the solution and the other guys copy it.
Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they oppose it.
Right.
And then you have a good Donnybrook about what's the right answer.
Right.
And that's what democratic societies are about. The peaceful resolution of disagreements.
But it's sort of annoying, isn't it, though, when a party, they'll shit all over their opposition, but they haven't come out with their own own stuff.
Yeah, that is, having been in the position of watching opposition parties do such a thing, and frankly, having been in the position within opposition parties doing such a thing, it's the most uncomfortable place to be in government.
Yeah. Could you just give me your take then on the Quebec Bridge? And we'll go through there's three fundamental strategies that John outlines here.
So the Quebec Bridge, I think, mathematically, when you look at the seat distribution of the country, you can see why it's an attractive conclusion to make. And I think it was truer back in maybe the first three elections that John writes about. But I also think, and this was in particular true about Mulroney's election in 1988, that he understood that people working, the working and middle class of Quebec had more in common with the working and middle class of Vancouver, Edmonton, Toronto than they did with necessarily with people in the regions of Quebec. That there was a developing economic class in the country,
right,
that transcended the traditional cultural signifiers, religious, linguistic,
right.
And I don't think it divided along ethnic lines. I really don't. I think that, I think, by the way, that's what makes the 1988 election so consequential. And it's continued to this day, that the country's sort of ruled by the suburbs, right?
Right.
And that the people living in the suburbs of Toronto have more in common with people living in the suburbs of Vancouver and Montreal than they do with people living in suburbs.
It's quite a divide, isn't it? Really, the lives of people in rural Canada versus...
Absolutely. I think that is absolutely the most consequential divide in the country, and it's one of the most troubling.
Well, it's funny. I drove across the country a year or two ago, and there's a lot
From where to where?
Well, I went from Montreal to Victoria, and then I went the other way too. So I
Okay.
drove.
So you
the
did
whole-
really, because
I
when
did
Central
the-
Canadians say they drove across the country,
No, no.
they usually mean from Montreal to Vancouver.
No.
That's why
I went the other.
Canadian Irish up.
No. We're not ignoring the most important part of the country.
The most beautiful, anyway.
Yeah. But I was upset. I was upset going because there's a lot of crappy looking towns.
Yeah.
And there's Dollaramas.
Yeah.
There's 1,300 Dollaramas, and there's about the same number of Shoppers Drug Marts.
Yeah.
And there's a bunch of cannabis stores. And I'm telling you, I don't, who the hell would want to live there?
Well, a lot of people. It's not just about the commercial enterprises in the towns. It's about the sense of community that's been built around them for 100 years.
Yeah, but the kids, if they can't work, they take off.
Oh, listen, I grew up in Glace Bay, Nova Scotia, Nigel. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But I do think that it's not healthy for the phrase that diversity is strength is not just a point about cultural backgrounds. It's also about different kinds of communities. And Canada is at its strongest when there are viable communities of all shapes and sizes. You can have a good life on a farm, or you can have a good life on Bloor Street, right?
Yeah.
And it's one of the most difficult things to reconcile in our politics, because increasingly it's dividing along those lines.
Yeah.
Right. So I think John kind of dances around this topic in this book, but if he were to look back at the last 25 years and not the first 100, I think, or 125, I think he would see that as one of the great politicians that'll be written about maybe by Martine in 25 years will be those who have been able to reconcile that divide.
Well, it's just concerning that there's not more sort of industry, a thriving industry in centers outside of our major cities.
Well, what is industry in 2023 though? Right? It's not it's between our ears.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily what it was in the 1950s or 1880s. We've all lived through this exceedingly weird period through the pandemic, which has upended everybody's conception of what work looks like or could look like. And our modern communications technology means that this is sort of I've done several podcasts.
I'm so happy, to breathe the same air.
Right, so here we are sitting down together
Yes.
in the same room in Ottawa, but we could have just as well done this after you go to Prague next week over Zoom.
We could have. Yeah. But I like you more in person.
Well, that's kind. That's very kind. It's very kind.
Okay, so the thing is, a question here then about the double tribal whipsaw.
Yeah.
Is that what Mulroney used, or the bridge?
I think both of those are. I've said some really nice things about John's book, so I'll say I think that's a little reductive.
Right.
I think that they're both a little reductive.
So can we explain that again then? One of them is like MacDonald had a block in Quebec that he took care of.
Yeah.
They voted for him. That's why he got into power.
Yeah.
And this double tribal whipsaw is going
It's
to
to play
the
both ends
extremes.
against the middle.
Well, what exactly does that mean?
Well, it means you take a perceived group of francophones who are antagonistic toward English Canada, and a perceived group of Western Anglophones who are antagonistic toward French Canada,
Right.
and you convince the middle that they need to be protected from both ends. So that was, I think, the strategy he was articulating. John was a brilliant guy, as you know. The problem with a lot of people of his intellectual caliber is they can overthink things.
Okay.
And I think I would humbly suggest that he was maybe overthinking this.
Okay. Well, the third one is the populist rush.
Right, the Diefenbaker.
I love Diefenbaker.
Yeah.
But apparently he was just a kick-ass orator.
Yeah.
And the people
one of the best.
yeah. And that, like, they kept interrupting him with standing ovations.
Yes.
And he loved the country.
He loved the country passionately.
Yes. And he wanted big projects.
He did.
I mean, I love that.
He did. And Diefenbaker's one of my favorite prime ministers. Mostly because he had this infectious sense of enthusiasm for the country's possibilities, right?
And I think that's maybe what rubbed the Americans the wrong way. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I think he was a true Canadian nationalist, and he believed he was very suspicious about the Americans, and there's obviously that strain that runs through our history. You know, one of the things I learned in this book, and there's so many things about the country's history that I would guess 99.9% of the people who read this book will learn many things about our country's history. Yeah, was that Diefenbaker lost in the 25 or 21
He lost a whole
election.
bunch of them. He tried to get in a whole bunch of times.
That, no, I know that.
Yes,
but that early he was trying,
and he wouldn't stop trying to get in.
Yeah, he lost in Prince Albert, and there was an opportunity. Of course, Mackenzie King ends up running in the by-election, and Diefenbaker wisely chooses not to contest it, which is fascinating to think about. And the role that the relationship between cabinet and your role as a cabinet minister and your role as a member of parliament, and how distinct those roles. I don't think I knew, and I think I know more about Canadian politics than the average bear. I don't think I knew it was a convention before I read this book back in the day, that when you were appointed to the cabinet, you had to resign and run the by-election, which is really interesting, right? Because it was considered a fundamental change in your status and ability to represent your constituents.
Well, yeah,
so you had to go back and get consent
to say, listen, I'm going to be spending more time on this other stuff rather than your dog license.
So I need your consent.
Yeah,
and that, of course, became not a loophole, but an opportunity that Mackenzie King exploited when the government fell in the King Byng controversy.
Yes, okay.
So
that's interesting.
It's very interesting.
Okay, so just moving right along. Are you okay for?
So the populist push. I think.
Populist push, yeah, and it was a national vision, right?
Yeah.
One Canada,
and most important, I think it was counter to the family compact dynamic that you're describing, and that's probably why you like Diefenbaker so much, because he said that a Canadian on a farm in Saskatchewan is as valuable as one on Bay Street. And that was truly the first, in the old sense of the term, populist campaign in successful populist campaign in Canadian history. And still the largest majority victory in Canadian history.
Yes, that'd be 1958. Yeah. I'm fascinated by that period, and just again making it about me. That's true. I think that with Walter Gordon's budget, that got because he wanted to basically try and get Canadians to own a bit more of the companies that were taking over all of the Canadian company, the American. Anyway, I think that was it. I think our country is.
So you're a subscriber to the Lament for a Nation thesis?
Yes. Well, I think that the definition of success for a Canadian startup is to get to a certain size and then sell out to the Americans. And that's why we don't have any middle-sized companies in this country.
Well, there's no doubt that is a problem in the Canadian economy. I don't think that it's definitional for the country at large, though. I think that the country is more than the particular composition of its economy at any given time, though it does, of course, color its character dramatically and materially.
I'm a fan of Mel Hertig.
Oh, yeah.
And his hate on for the banks, I think, is totally justified. The banks helped finance the takeover of Canada. I think he should be read along with this book.
Well, banks, you shouldn't expect financial institutions to be...
Well, there's only 5 of them. I mean, it's, there's no competition.
Well, they're pretty competitive with each other.
The service sucks. But I'm just speaking... anyway. So we're getting
As a general
ready.
principle, the Canadian economy could use more competition in it, for sure. I'm not sure that our financial sector is the first place I'd start.
No. Telephones, please, and
Correct.
dairy. Moving right along here. Yeah, just to comment then about the book as object.
It's a beautiful book. It's interesting because it's sort of a graphic novel,
Yeah.
right? And in some ways, John was ahead of his time with this book. It has speaking of the interplay between culture and economics, it has the downside of being expensive, both to produce and to own, which is probably why it is tragically out of print right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I had lost my original copy. I had to borrow this copy from a friend to refresh my memory about it when we first talked about doing the podcast, which is why I have all these sticky notes on mine and I didn't underline passages because it belongs to somebody else.
Right.
I really hope, if nothing else comes out of this podcast, someone decides to reprint this book.
Well, you know what? I thought that it looked. First of all, I love the fact there's all these different little bits of ephemera
Yes,
in it.
yeah.
I'm a collector,
Yeah,
and
ditto.
I love this.
Ditto.
So, and I guess
It's kinda
John
like a
must have been a collector, was he?
He must have been, because
Yeah.
it's like the best form of a scrapbook.
Totally, it
Yeah.
is.
Had
It's
you-
proof. It's
exactly,
proof.
exactly. Had
Yeah.
you lived through, I love how, he reproduces a copy of Bing's letter to King
Yes.
in response. It's just, it's so beautiful. And I think I'm a big fan of political cartoons.
Yes.
And one of my prized possessions is I have a collection of political cartoons from the U.S. Civil War. And it reminds me all the time when American politics you hear all these superlatives. America's never been more polarized, never been more divided.
Yeah.
Let me show you any one of these given cartoons where Abraham Lincoln is depicted as a guerrilla for the Emancipation Proclamation.
Yeah.
I think things have been worse. And you get the same feeling in this book, right?
You do. It's so wonderful. I mean, you've got these flyers, you've got these posters, you've got brochures, you've got all, like buttons. It's the thing when I look at this book, I think
Pictures of Parliament Hill. Laurier walking up Parliament Hill for the first time as Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And you can feel yourself in that skin almost, because it's so vivid.
Yes, and again, it's because they've pulled together all this memorabilia.
Yes, memorabilia is the right word.
Yeah. I mean, this looks to me like it's, speaking of the Civil War, Ken Burns, there's a great book that Knopf put out with TV. How come there wasn't a TV series on this?
Maybe there should be.
This is exactly what, the CBC should be doing.
CBC, TVO, CTV, anybody could do Netflix could do a series on this. And they probably should.
Well,
maybe they could add the 2015 election.
That's right. Okay, so just winding down here then. What strategy did you use to win that election? Like, did
the
you
2015 election?
Yeah.
Like all strategies, I think I appreciate the plaudits, but politics, like anything worth doing in life, is a team sport, and there were a lot of people involved.
Right. That aside, the modesty aside, you're credited with having been the architect. So what did you do to win?
Well, I think we did, and I will insist on that, because whenever I speak to students, for instance, they ask me a similar question. I say, if you take nothing away from my talk, realize that you can't get anything done. Politics without a team of people who are all ad idem and similarly passionate about your goal. So it really is a team sport. Anything worth accomplishing is, from hockey to business to politics. So I think what we understood about the Canadian public better than our opponents did was that fundamentally Harper's economic policy had failed. And it had failed regular people, and they knew it.
It failed because they didn't get enough social services?
No, because they didn't feel they were participating in growth. It goes back to the point you made about income inequality at the beginning, that middle-class Canadians thought that they were getting screwed by an economy that worked for wealthy people and not for them.
Okay.
And as a consequence, I think they had already decided as early as 2014, maybe even 2013, that they weren't going to vote for Stephen Harper again. And we had deep conviction about that.
Mm-hmm.
So we knew the election was going to be a contest over who the public felt had the right economic plan for the times. And they weren't going to be satisfied with plaudits, with simple kind of vanilla milquetoast bullshit, if I can put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
That you were going to have to slay some dragons, right? You were going to have to say you were going to raise some people's taxes so you could lower other people's taxes because the economy had gotten less fair.
What about an inheritance tax for people who've got over $10 million? What about that?
It doesn't raise a lot of money.
That's what I hear, but I think that's bullshit.
Well, if you want to set aflame yet another, if you want to create yet another cottage industry of people who can afford to pay well-heeled advisors to avoid paying their taxes, do that. It would be great for well-paid accountants, that kind of policy. But so anyway, to get back to your question,
yes.
I think that what the NDP didn't see,
because you went from third to first.
Yeah, right? Well, we went from first to third and then back to first, which is really unusual. But it is the only time that we won the largest net gain of seats in Canadian history in 2015. Mm-hmm. And it was the first time that someone went from third place to a majority government, right? And I think that was, it's easy to look back on it now as an historical inevitability. But at the time, people were writing that the death of the Liberal Party was an historical inevitability, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that the combination of the state-of-the-art campaign methods, the Prime Minister's performance on the campaign.
He's a great campaigner.
He's a great campaigner. Yeah. And the core message of the campaign, backed up by concrete policies that people could wrap their heads around, that's what all those things came together to make that kind of magic happen. But it started with the idea that, which was counterintuitive, because in the polls, if you'd asked people a question, who's best on the economy, they would have said Stephen Harper. Mm-hmm. But we didn't think that was the right question.
That's the thing that John gets into, isn't it? It's and I think it's common knowledge among that you've got to get them asking the right question when they go into the booth.
Exactly, yeah. and I think we frame that like all plans. The best laid plans, the best plans are simple plans, and our plan was really simple. That we were going to focus on that core question. We were going to prosecute that case, mm-hmm. and the NDP didn't realize that they were sort of in a contest with us and not the government. Mm-hmm. So there was, I think this point is a little bit overdone, but it'll make the point I'm trying to make. There was sort of a progressive primary in the first half of the campaign where the public was trying to decide who was the most authentic progressive change from the Harper years. And we had ground to make up because the NDP had just won in Alberta, and they were seen to be, obviously the bigger change because they'd never been the government.
And Mulcair was really good in Parliament too, prosecuting.
Yeah, although I thought about Tom Mulcair, whom I actually like a lot as a person. He was once very kind to my children, who were very intimidated about being in Parliament, and I'll never forget it. He was a very, very kind man.
But he was more than that. He was direct. He was
right.
great.
John makes the point that possibly the greatest, before Diefenbaker, the greatest parliamentary orator in the history of the country was Arthur Meighen.
Yes. And who the hell knows about him?
Exactly, who the hell's Arthur Meighen?
Yeah.
And he routinely slayed Mackenzie King in Parliament, but Mackenzie King was fine losing in Parliament and winning in the ballot box.
Yes, yeah. Wily,
the wiliest.
Yeah. Okay, right here, I care not, this is James Joyce, I care not if I live but a day and a night, so long as my deeds live after me. So I want to thank you for.
You have to give some people context for why you quoted James Joyce.
I need to do that. Yes. Well, why don't you do that for me?
Well, we both love James Joyce, and I spent much of my academic career, such as it was, thinking about James Joyce and reading James Joyce, and still consider him to be the greatest of all writers in the English language.
Well, thanks for bringing John back with me.
It's bittersweet. It's really bittersweet. He was such a lovely guy, and if Joyce is right, and he's right about most things, then John's spirit is certainly captured in this book. And for people who knew him, you'll enjoy reading it again because you'll feel like he's in the room with you. And for those of you who didn't, I think you'll get a sense of why the people who did loved him so much.
Nicely put. Gerry Butts is the vice chairman of the Eurasia Group, a risk management consulting firm based both in Canada and
we're
all
all
over
over the world. Yeah, we're all over the world. But our headquarters are in New York.
Okay, excellent. Thanks so much again.
Real pleasure to meet you,
Okay.
Nigel. Take care. I hope this
Yeah, it's lovely.
was what you were hoping
I
for.
just had, I hope you enjoyed yourself.
What's your favorite thing you've read this year? Well, let's say 2022.
Oh, that's a good question. You know what?
Do you subscribe to the one book theory? Do you know the one book theory? I ask everybody I spend.
Well, War and Peace is the greatest book ever written.
No. Everybody gets one book.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask you to recommend a book to me. And if I agree with your assessment of it, I will ask you for another. And I will
Okay.
probably trust your judgment on books as
That's
long as
very
we
good.
both live.
Can I
You
can I be sunny ways and postpone that?
Yes, you can. I didn't want to put you on the spot.
But it's okay. I think I'm still taping here, so I might include that. Let's see.
Well, you must be a Kafka fan if you're going to Prague.
Oh yes,
Sometime in Prague.
yes. Well, you go through a Kafka phase. I think I was when I was quite a bit younger. I wrote a piece on him not that long ago, and Prague. So
my favorite single story involves Franz Kafka and
you mean?
and Max Brod.
Oh yes, the fact that he said destroy it all.
No, well that's
Why
a great
you
story.
know why he said that though?
Well, he didn't mean it.
Well, he said he did mean it because he was fearful that it would actually get into the conscience of people and actually happen. I just learned that about 6 months ago.
Well,
That he was concerned.
I'm familiar with that theory. I don't buy it because
you don't buy it, okay?
because
Okay.
Franz Kafka didn't actually believe in individual agency.
Okay.
So here's my favorite.
But he was more airy fairy.
Yeah,
He's
yeah,
thinking
it's
getting
injected
in
into the
the
bloodstream.
the collective conscience.
You'll never forget this story. So Franz Kafka.
Consciousness. Sorry.
Kafka and Brod are walking around interwar Prague. You can think about this as you walk across the bridge. And Kafka, you can imagine what it was like to be two Jews in Prague in 1930 or 25 or whatever it was.
A friend of mine said spat on from both sides of the street.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he says, I think we're living through one of those periods in history where we've screwed things up so badly that God has just absconded from the world, that he's gone. And this, of course, has great precedent in Jewish exegetical tradition that there are periods in the non-prophetic eras where God is just not there, and and Israel is being punished for their sins by God's absence. And Kafka says to Brod, "I think we're living through one of those periods now." And Brod says, "Well, there's no hope then." And Kafka says, "Oh no, there's always hope. There's an infinity of hope, but not for us." I love that story.
Yeah. Listen, I just come up with a book for you.
What is it?
You probably read the small version on tyranny. Have you read the graphic?
No, I haven't.
The graphic illustrated version?
No, I haven't.
It's amazing. I interviewed the illustrator, Nora Krug.
Oh, interesting.
I can't say enough good things about On Tyranny, but it has to be the illustrated
Okay,
version.
I will pick that up.
All right.
Nice to see you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.